For thousands of years, the world believed the pyramids were built by slaves, whipped forward under a burning sun, worked until they collapsed, discarded the moment they could no longer lift another stone. This image has been repeated in movies, textbooks, and popular imagination for centuries. But in 1990, a tourist riding a horse near the Giza pyramids stumbled into a hole in the sand. What that hole revealed would completely rewrite everything historians thought they knew about who actually built these monuments. And it raises a question almost nobody asks. If these workers weren't slaves, what actually happened to them once they got old or too injured to keep working? Let's start with what that discovery actually showed. Buried beneath the sand near the pyramids, archaeologists found an entire cemetery. Not a mass grave, not an unmarked pit. A proper cemetery filled with individual tombs built specifically for pyramid workers. In ancient Egypt, burial near a pharaoh's monument was considered an extraordinary honor. Slaves were never granted this kind of treatment. As Egypt's former antiquities chief Zahi Hawass put it, slaves would not have been allowed to build their own tombs beside their kings.
So where did the slave myth actually come from? Historians trace it back to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. Writing centuries after the fact and relying on secondhand stories, Herodotus described the workers as enslaved masses. Centuries later, Hollywood took that idea and turned it into the image most people still picture today. But the physical evidence buried in the ground told a very different story. Excavations near the pyramids uncovered an entire workers' village, complete with bakeries, breweries, food storage buildings, and organized housing. This wasn't a prison camp. It was a functioning community built specifically to support the people constructing the pyramids. Records and food remains show the laborers were fed extremely well for their time. Archaeologists found evidence of daily meat rations, including dozens of cattle and sheep slaughtered specifically to feed the workforce. Bread and beer were also standard parts of their diet, staples that provided essential calories for grueling physical labor.
Perhaps most surprising of all, these workers had access to organized medical care. Skeletal remains discovered in the workers' cemetery show healed fractures, successful amputations, and even evidence of skull surgery performed with real medical skill. These weren't lucky accidents. This was intentional, structured treatment for injuries that would have otherwise been fatal. In other words, when a worker got hurt, someone treated them and gave them a real chance to recover. Now, here's where the story becomes far more complicated than simple myth-busting. Just because these workers weren't slaves doesn't mean the work itself was easy or safe. Skeletal analysis reveals severe physical toll on the people who built these monuments. Compressed spinal discs, arthritis, healed but clearly painful fractures, evidence of intense repetitive strain from years of hauling massive stone blocks. Historians studying these remains have been careful to note that while workers were cared for, the labor itself was genuinely brutal and often shortened their lives. Most of the workforce operated under what's known as a corvée system. This wasn't permanent forced labor. It was closer to a rotating national labor obligation. Farmers were seasonally conscripted to work on state projects during the months when the Nile flooded and their fields couldn't be farmed anyway. Evidence, including ancient logbooks, shows workers were organized into named rotational gangs, often serving in shifts lasting around 3 months before returning home to their families and farms. This detail matters enormously for understanding what happened to workers as they aged. For the majority of laborers, seasonal farmers conscripted temporarily, growing older likely meant something fairly simple. Eventually, your body could no longer handle repeated hauling seasons, and your rotational obligation quietly ended. You returned to farming or whatever trade sustained your family the rest of the year, aging within your normal village life rather than within the pyramid workforce itself.
But not everyone involved in pyramid construction was a temporary, seasonal laborer. Alongside the rotating farmers, there existed a smaller group of permanent, skilled workers. Engineers, stonemasons, artisans, overseers with specific titles like overseer of the side of the pyramid. These were career specialists, not seasonal conscripts, and their relationship with aging and retirement almost certainly looked very different. Historians studying similar skilled worker communities from later periods, particularly the well-documented village of Deir el-Medina, where royal tomb builders lived generations later, found something revealing. These specialized labor communities were often intensely generational. Sons frequently learned their father's exact trade and eventually took over specific roles within the same workforce.
This suggests that as skilled workers aged and their physical strength declined, many likely shifted towards supervisory, teaching, or planning roles, rather than simply being discarded once their bodies weakened.
There's also documented evidence from these skilled worker communities of something remarkably close to organized welfare. Texts recovered from Deir el-Medina describe paid sick leave and state-rationed medical supplies distributed specifically to support injured or unwell workers. This wasn't universal across all of ancient Egypt, but it does prove the concept of structured worker support wasn't entirely foreign to Egyptian society. Even so, it's important to be honest about the limits of what we actually know. There's no clear evidence of anything resembling a formal pension system, no guaranteed retirement fund, no fixed age where work simply stopped and support automatically began. For the vast majority of ancient Egyptians, growing old almost certainly meant relying primarily on family. Multiple generations often lived and worked together, and aging parents were expected to be supported by their children in exchange for the resources and trade knowledge passed down earlier in life.
This reveals something important about how ancient Egyptian society actually functioned beneath its famous monuments. It wasn't the state that primarily protected people in old age. It was the family unit itself, reinforced by community ties and, in some skilled trades, modest structured support from the state for injury and illness specifically tied to active service. Now, compare all of this to how modern society approaches aging and retirement. Pension systems, retirement savings accounts, government-administered social security, structured healthcare specifically designed for elderly citizens. These systems exist precisely because most people today no longer live in the kind of multi-generational family and community structure ancient Egyptians relied on by necessity. When family support weakened as populations grew and moved into cities, formal systems eventually had to replace what family networks used to provide automatically.
In many ways, the pyramid workers reveal something far more interesting than the slave myth ever did. They weren't chained prisoners, and they weren't modern employees with guaranteed retirement either. They existed in a middle space, respected, valued, and cared for during active service, but ultimately dependent afterward on the same thing humans have relied on for most of history: family, community, and whatever skill or reputation they managed to build during the years their bodies could still do the work. The pyramids themselves have survived for more than 4,000 years, but the people who built them, farmers rotating through seasonal labor, and skilled craftsmen passing trades down to their sons, eventually simply grew old the same way everyone in their world did. Not abandoned, not enslaved, but quietly folded back into the ordinary rhythm of family life once their extraordinary work on history's most famous monuments was finally done. Make sure you subscribe to the channel